Hello and welcome to this new edition of Minds Between Languages. Our guest today is Pawel Korpal and we discuss stress in interpreting.
Well, it's lovely to see you here. Thank you very much for joining us in Minds Between Language.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ann-Katrine, and the whole team. I'm super happy to be here today.
Yeah, we are very excited, and I'm particularly excited because you are my expert for stress. I've been talking to quite a few researchers. We always touched on the topic, and this is why I'm so happy to talk about stress now with you as the expert. And one of my problems with that term, I feel sometimes we mean different things when we say stress. It seems to be a little bit like an umbrella term. What is your opinion?
I do agree that it's actually quite a complex term and a complex concept. And I would say that depending on the approach, various aspects of stress are kind of emphasized. Celia came up with the idea that stress is a physiological reaction, which is based on a fight or flight response. So basically, there is something in the environment that you are not indifferent to, so your body would react physiologically to that. But then, from a more psychological perspective, for example, in the model by Lazarus and Folkman, what was emphasized is a transaction between this environment and your coping resources. So basically, I would say that it emphasizes the fact that we are all different and we all react differently to a potentially stressful or endangering situation. And actually, the way you perceive it and the way you will react to a potential stressor depends on your coping resources. So just to give an example, and apologies if it's trivial, but I mean, it might be really hard for someone to, come up on stage and give a talk. And that might be because of some, a lack of coping resources that a person might have to deal with a potential stressful situation. Okay, so there is something in the environment and something that is potentially stressful, but in this model by Lazarus and Folkman, what is really important is how you perceive it and what coping resources you actually have to deal with the stressor. I kind of like, because I have the same problem sometimes when I'm asked to speak of stress, when I'm asked to write about it. So at some point I felt like, okay, I need a definition. So instead of just, or on top of just looking at different perspectives and approaches, I need like a definition that would, encompass everything that is related to stress. So I think what I sometimes use, and I'm going to read this one out, it's from Herman, 2011, stress is a real or anticipated threat to homeostasis or an anticipated threat to well-being. And I think that there is a general, agreement in the literature that this is how it works, that that these threats may trigger a stress response, that the stress response activates the organism, including our autonomic nervous system. And importantly, and I think that also answers your question about different approaches to stress, this activation of our organism, including the autonomic nervous system, is needed for stress adaptation. Yeah, because stress is about our adaptation to these challenging circumstances or conditions in the environment. And I do think it's important. Also, Celia, I mentioned him already. He discussed eustress and distress again decades ago. So eustress is more like that's about these positive aspects of stress. So that's something that is positive, is motivating. It can help you perform better. And then distress is more like negative, and that will be subjectively viewed by a person that experienced that as something overwhelming. So that's another thing, and I can see that many interpreting scholars as well, they would refer to this differentiation, that stress, this or the adaptation of the organism, the activation, can be both positive and negative. And that might depend on various things. That might depend on how you view it and whether you have the coping resources to deal with the stress. I think that might also depend on your experience, that at some point it starts to be less overwhelming, and you view it as, okay, my body is motivating now and is being activated now for me to function well. So that's, again, another thing about, the different aspects of stress, that it can be positive and negative. So you asked about this umbrella term. So stress is an umbrella term. And I do think that it can be viewed also as something momentary that is happening right now. But I'll be really curious to learn and to read more about chronic stress in interpreting as well, where this activation can actually be quite dysregulated. I think that in the research I know, we mainly look at an experience of stress resulting from the experimental task. So more, momentary rather than the risk of chronic stress in interpreting. I would say that these, accumulated risks are quite often researched in community interpreting or public service interpreting, if you like. And I think that we will discuss it probably later on as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You mentioned so many different facets. Actually, stress is a really multifaceted concept. And you also mentioned, and I found it very interesting, this distinction also between the momentary stress that we might actually want to trigger in research, right? If we want interpreters to undergo a slightly stressful situation to see what happens actually. And then the more chronic stress that was more emphasized in community and public service interpreting. And this actually really brings me to the next question. Now, what are typical sources of stress in those two modes? Is there an overlap or is it totally different?
I would say there is an overlap, but they are also different. So let me just try to give you some examples. I think that there's quite a lot of research actually on stress factors in conference interpreting. And there is a seminal study conducted by AIC, the interpreter or interpreter's workload study. And one of the research questions, or one of the aims of the study, which was conducted with conference interpreters, was to look at stress factors. And they identified, for example, fast speaker as a potential stress factor in conference interpreting, textual complexity, reading from notes or reading aloud as opposed to just speaking, difficult accent. But also, and I remember when I was reading about this, I found it quite interesting, booth discomfort. So, stress factors in interpreting, they don't have to be about the speaker and how they speak. So it doesn't have to be about what we have to interpret, the content, but also working conditions. And, unsatisfactory working conditions can actually elevate stress in conference interpreters. There's quite a lot of research on remote interpreting or media interpreting as a potential stress factor. And I really want to bring this up because it shows something interesting about stress and a potential difference between how we view it again and the more objective physiological manifestations of stress. So, for example, Rosiner and Schlesinger, 2010, they conducted a study on stress in interpreting, and they could see that interpreters perceive remote interpreting as more distressing, but that was not reflected in physiological measures that were adopted in the study, and it was not really reflected to a large extent in interpreting quality. I found it really interesting, and I think that kind of we circle back to different approaches to stress and what it actually means, and the fact that it can be subjectively rated but it's also something that is a physiological reaction. And I found it really interesting in the study that there was no correlation. Okay, so you
So
can view
no.
something as more stressful, but it's not really reflected in the the psychophysiology of interpreting, and it's not really reflected in quality. So maybe, but that's my hypothesis, but maybe it again just shows that stress can be either positive or negative, because you may feel, okay, yes, I did experience arousal, I did experience some kind of stress, but it didn't impact my quality. It didn't impact the quality of interpreting. So maybe that was more of a positive experience, that was something that motivated an interpreter to perform well. I didn't test it, and just a hypothesis, but it might be the case that since you can feel it and you subjectively describe yourself as being stressed, it still does not impact your quality.
So your hypothesis, basically, if I understand you correctly, is that you might very well experience stress and even describe yourself as being stressed in the sense that, oh my God, my pulse is elevated and I'm a little bit nervous and so on. But then your appreciation, let's say, of the situation might be still a positive one.
Yeah,
And so you might not view that necessarily as something that is negative. Do I understand
I
you
think
correctly?
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe more of a didactic or side remark, but I personally think it's actually quite important to remember about this positive aspect of stress, and maybe stress being some kind of an adaptation.
And an activation.
Exactly. And it might actually use it to perform better. And I sometimes actually tell my students, and I tell myself, like, okay, you feel some kind of tension. You're experiencing that right now. But remember, it's actually for you to perform better. Your body just feels that something important is going to happen. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, that you will be paralyzed. No. Your body motivates because it knows that something that you are not indifferent to is about to happen. And that can give you focus, and that can, motivate your organism to perform well, as simple as that. So I do think it's important. But getting back to your question, because you asked about conference interpreting and public service interpreting. In public service interpreting, I think that the content itself may be more stress inducing because it is in general more emotionally charged. I don't want to generalize, but I think that that would be my view. That would be my take. That in settings such as legal interpreting, if you treat it as a subtype of community interpreting, in a setting like medical interpreting, working with migrants, working at police stations, I think that the situation, the context, and the content itself may be more stress inducing. And why is it so? I mean, I'm personally a conference interpreter. I don't have experience, firsthand experience in community interpreting, but I believe that it's maybe more difficult to distance yourself because you work usually for individuals. Quite often there is an imbalance of power.
Yeah.
People talk about their intimate or private experiences.
And
They share sensitive information. So I think it's actually important for it not to be stress inducing or emotionally taxing, if
yeah,
that's the case. Of course, you might say it's not always the case. And I agree. So interpreting does not have to be,
but
emotionally taxing.
yeah.
Also, I remember this discussion of ethical stress by Hoopsher Davidson.
Mm.
And I also have a definition. So she treats or she looks at ethical stress as some kind of disparity between one's ethical values and expected behaviors. And I would say that the risk of this ethical stress to happen can actually be higher in community interpreting as well.
Difficult decisions that you need to take and that are
Exactly.
not clear cut, right?
Yes, and you are with the people, you're with individuals. They might misunderstand your role. They might want you to take sides, which you shouldn't do because you have to be impartial as an interpreter. So these are just my observations. This is something I haven't researched, but I do believe that will be the difference, that the context and the content can be more emotionally charged in public service interpreting. And yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, I mean, if you interpret in a community public service context, then of course your interpretation is also has very important implications for the individuals, right? It has an immediate repercussions on whatever status they might have, whether they're going to prison or whether not, or whether they're receiving a difficult diagnosis or maybe not, right? You have conducted a study on affect-laden speech, which is of course, one of the major stress factors in community and public service interpreting. Can you tell us more about it?
I think that in the past, I focused, or when I thought of emotion in interpreting, and maybe that's exactly what I've just done with you, is that there is a tendency, or I had a tendency to look at negative affect. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's natural on the other hand, because all the research pointing to a risk of vicarious trauma in public service interpreters, I think it's very important, needed. It's socially relevant. So I understand that we tend to focus on that or might want to focus on that. But what I learned to mention whenever I speak of emotion is that let's remember that it's also about positive affect. And this is actually what we focused on the study you mentioned. So that's a recent project that was funded by the National Science Center Poland. And I was working with my colleagues, Professor Katarzyna Jankowiak and Professor Łukasz Kaczmarek. And I would say that our main aim was to look at how affective language is processed by interpreters. So we looked at the process of interpreting negative, positive, and neutral sentences. So it was a very, I would say, psycholinguistic study or psycholinguistically oriented study where we looked at sentences, so single sentences pre-tested as our stimuli. And we looked at the potential impact of valence, so how you process neutral versus positive and negative sentences. So we included positive. We looked at a potential impact of directionality. Our interpreters were Polish-English interpreters, so they had Polish as their native language and English as their working language. So we were interested in whether it's different or it makes any difference when you interpret from your native language onto your foreign language, and vice versa, in terms of the experience of emotion.
Mm-hmm. And so then you presented your stimuli to your interpreters.
Mm-hmm. Yes, professional interpreters. And we also looked at a potential impact of modality that was across studies. So in study one, the sentences were presented auditorily. So basically, the interpreters could not see the speaker on screen. And in study two, they could see the speaker. So we also wanted in this way to look at whether it makes any difference. It's quite two studies, a few variables, a few factors. So it's really difficult to summarize the results, but I think that we could observe that valence makes a difference because we could see a main effect of sentence type for a questioner, for questioner data. We used Supin by Brzozowski, which is a Polish adaptation of PANAS, Positive and Negative Affect Schedule by Watson et al.
So it's an instrument to measure emotions, basically.
Exactly, yes. So that's a self-report measure. We also use EDA, so electrodermal activity and heart rate. So that was the psychophysiological component. And we also looked at reaction times. So how long it takes to produce the interpretation, and also how long it takes for interpreters to think about the interpretation before they start speaking. So we looked at that as well. So we could see the main effect of sentence type for questionnaire data. We could see the main effect of sentence type for response times, and also for psychophysiology. But here only for some EDA measures. Not all of them, and we couldn't see, as far as I remember correctly, the main effect of sentence type for heart rate. But all in all, I think that we can conclude that valence makes a difference. The results for directionality are more inconclusive. So we could see the main impact of directionality on heart rate data. So it was more arousing to interpret from L1 to L2, so from your native language.
I understand.
I was not surprised myself, but this is less conclusive because we couldn't see that for many physiological markers used in the study, but we could see that also for response times.
Right, and in response times, how, for instance, did that look like precisely? Were the reaction times or response times higher for maybe negative sentences?
Yes. So I'm looking now at the data for sentence type, and we could see that it took our interpreters longer to think about how to phrase their interpretation for both negative and positive sentences as opposed to neutral sentences. And I have to tell you, Anne-Catherine, that I was actually I wasn't surprised, but it really made me think. And I was happy with this feeling, like sometimes you analyze the data and you're like, okay, that's interesting. So I remember my reaction, that's interesting, and I'm happy to see that. And I remember we discussed it in the research team how to interpret that, and I find it to be very, very interesting that, and it was very statistically significant that interpreters took longer to think of a phrasing, so the rendition in the target language of an effective sentence as opposed to a neutral one. And we could debate why is it so. I think that there is something like, when you also in communication, so the study was about interpreting, but I think that sometimes when we communicate something emotional, something positive to someone, something negative, maybe we kind of think twice, and because we feel it's important, it's affect laden, so it basically takes us longer to think of how to phrase it. But again, I'm debating with you now, and
Of course.
it's a potential interpretation of that. But I do remember I found it to be really, really interesting.
It is indeed a very interesting result, right? So that you would have the same reaction for positive and negative stimuli, where you would maybe expect a difference. I don't know you, but spontaneously when you started talking about it, I thought like, certainly that will be the difference.
Yes.
But no, it's actually more about, let's say, the intensity of the emotion rather than the valence, right?
Yes.
Very, very interesting. Do you think it makes me think also a little bit. I wonder whether they needed some time to process also the emotions in the stimuli. Do you think that could also play a role, or?
Probably. Oh, yes. So not only about how to phrase that, so that's understandable, but yeah, just simply processing the emotion. Yeah, that might be the case.
Yeah. Wonderful. It's really absolutely fascinating. And so if you would find this kind of effect-laden situation in a simultaneous interpreting context, let's say, you would also assume that, of course, the emotions would transpire through the interpreter.
I think so. And that's anecdotal evidence, but I know from my colleagues that sometimes they actually were on the verge of crying themselves in a booth.
Right.
Conference interpreters, because something just triggered them, or something, or or maybe the speaker was very emotional. So yeah, so still, I think it's more about the context rather than the mode. Yes.
Of course, that makes perfect sense, and it's also a wonderful example. You mentioned at the very beginning, actually, that there are coping strategies for stress. And now, of course, in your study, you had students, but you had also professional interpreters. Did you see any differences in your studies overall? You worked with students and with professional interpreters, but could you notice some differences in coping with stress?
It's interesting because so that was this study where I looked at the potential impact of delivery rate on accuracy, so interpreting accuracy and stress. And indeed, we had two groups, so trainees and professionals. And now look, I think that was really interesting because I couldn't see any statistically significant differences between the groups in terms of the level of stress experienced, but there was an unsurprising difference in interpreting accuracy. So basically, professionals provided better interpretations or more accurate interpretations than students, but the level of stress was similar. And again, I find it to be interesting also in the context of what we were discussing today, because maybe that's
Absolutely.
also about the way we learn to manage stress. So the same amount, the same level of stress can sometimes compromise your interpreting quality or accuracy, and sometimes not. And maybe that's it has something to do with expertise, with experience. Again, that's my hypothesis. Maybe that's about coping, and that's about how you manage your.
Maybe that is what we see exactly, is to say, is the effect of coping actually. And very interesting also to see that the perception is still the same, right? You might think maybe I get used to all this stress when I'm sitting in the booth like every day, but no, obviously, that's not so much the case. But now tell me, how do professionals cope with stress? What are common coping strategies? Is there something that students could learn from that?
I think so. And we did one study, and this one was actually on community interpreters, mainly working in the States. And this is a project that was part of my Fulbright scholarship. And we focused in this study on the concept of self-care because we actually saw in interviews, because that was an interview-based study, that many interpreters mentioned that the importance of self-care in community interpreting. We used a classification of self-care behavior or behaviors by Postons and Gall, 2020, and they actually have they have 6 main domains of self-care, and it's awareness, balance, flexibility, physical health, social support, and spirituality. And we could see examples of all of them in our interpreters. So what can it be? What can this self-care be about? Well, it can be about being assertive. I do remember cases also of interpreters saying that they try to avoid, if they can, certain topics, or they try to avoid certain types of events because they know it's a lot for them and it's potentially too much for them. So it's also about your awareness of what's
Who you
good
are
for
and
you.
what you can do,
Exactly.
right?
Yes. And I really love these examples, but also assertiveness, kind of like educating the clients and reminding them what our role is, what our role is not, and also things which are, of course, broader, and we can use it in life in general. But interpreters mention that and emphasize that quite a lot. So the importance of social support, so more personal but also professional. Some interpreters mentioned the need for some kind of debriefing sessions and where they can speak about the experience. Of course, in a confidential manner, so not sharing what they should not share, but still to be able to maybe vent in a way this emotion, or at least just talk about the experience and listen to what colleagues say, how they deal with the problem. So that's something that was suggested in these interviews as well. But as I said, I mean, I think awareness is also quite important. So just being aware of what our role entails, preparation, that's obvious, but also I also discuss it with my students that remember, I mean, you will prepare for an event, and especially maybe in conference interpreting, you will have so much material to prepare. Maybe not everything that you would like to have before the conference, but you will spend some time preparing, and I personally treat it as a coping strategy as well, because you feel like you're prepared, you have the terminology, you have the knowledge, you're not an expert, like you're probably not a doctor at a medical conference, you're an interpreter, but you have this knowledge you learned for an assignment. So I think it can be treated as a nice coping strategy as well. And it kind of leads me to another study that I've conducted with sworn translators and interpreters in Poland. And I'm saying translators and interpreters because in Poland, we don't really have a division into certified or sworn, if you like, translators and interpreters. When you pass an exam, you are expected to do both. So that was the sample, professionals who both interpret and translate. And it leads me to this study because I could see that this preparation or task-oriented coping, planning, focus on the task when you interpret and when you translate is very helpful. And that's something that interpreters in this and translators in this questionnaire study, because that was a survey study, they emphasize quite a lot. I also remember that quite high on the scale and were acceptance of problems. So just accepting that some things might
are
happen.
difficult.
Yeah, but also I remember they mentioned physical activity. So there's like an overlap with the study we did with Chris on community interpreters. Yeah.
That sounds indeed very, very helpful, also for practicing interpreters who might eventually listen to this podcast at one point. Now, we've been talking, of course, a lot about stress, more like in a negative way. But then, as you already mentioned, there is the positive side. There's all the joy, there's all the excitement of interpreting, all the, this gratifying feeling that it also brings. If I know now I've helped someone actually to manage a difficult landscape. And as far as I know, most interpreters are really passionate about their job. How can we explain this self-reported stress on one hand and then the passion on the other hand?
I think it's quite simple. Like you work with people, you work across cultures, so you can expect various emotions, right? So it's teamwork also. You work with a booth mate. As I said, you facilitate communication. What I personally love about interpreting is that this communication happens in front of you. So it's not like you translate the text and then somebody will read a book, which is awesome as well. But here, this communication happens in front of you. You witness that. You see that your renditions help people communicate. So
the effect, right?
exactly. So it's so rewarding, and I hope it is for many interpreters. It's maybe a big word, but it might be a mission since you help people. Think of all the community settings that you mentioned, that we talked about. But it's also cognitively taxing, isn't it? It can be emotionally taxing. As I said, our role can be misunderstood. So that can create some kind of frustration. And I know that kind of on purpose, I'm discussing various aspects right now and providing potentially unrelated examples because I think that this is how it works. You can expect various emotions. I do think it's such an interesting job in general. There might be some emotionally charged content in medical interpreting, right? There might be very excited speakers in conference interpreting. And actually, that's what I love about the job myself. Like when I see that someone is excited about what they say, I kind of feel this excitement myself, and I think it's reflected in the interpretation. So yes, just to sum up, I think that you just summarized that perfectly. Like it is emotion, it is negative affect on one hand, but it's passion on the other, and it's maybe the mission of helping people, and how rewarding it actually gets, and it can be. So yeah, I think it's just such an interesting job that entails all these things.
Positive and negative emotions, and one obviously does not exclude the other. Thank you so much, Pavel. It was lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. And
Thank you so much.
maybe
Yeah,
next
thank you
time.
so much. I was so happy to discuss it, and thank you so much to everyone who will listen. And it's been a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.